In the heart of a silent frontier town, where dust clung to every breath, one girl stood exposed before a merciless crowd, until a rancher broke the silence with a single act of mercy. Dust drifted like smoke across the town square, stirred by the restless hooves of horses tied to rails. It clung to boots, to coats, to the dry lips of men who had come to witness the auction. Noon sun bore down with a cruel indifference, burning the wooden platform until it creaked. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, leather, and the faint sourness of spilled whiskey from the saloon across the way. They had gathered in silence, hats pulled low, eyes narrowed against both the light and their own conscience. Men leaned against posts, women stood with arms crossed, children tugged at skirts to ask questions their mothers did not answer. At the center stood the girl, barefoot, thin as a fence rail, though not broken. She had nothing to shield herself but her hands, drawn tight across her chest as though modesty alone might hold her dignity intact. Her hair, once long, had been braided hastily, strands falling loose like torn ribbons. That braid, though simple, spoke of another life, of hands that had once woven it with care. The sheriff stood nearby, unease etched across his face. He shifted his weight, tugged at the leather strap of his belt, but said nothing. This was not his law to stop. The auctioneer, a man with a voice usually sharp as a knife, seemed muted today. He cleared his throat, glanced at the crowd, and waited for the first bid. But no one spoke. The girl's eyes lifted. Wide, unbroken, they traveled slowly across the crowd, meeting faces that could not bear the weight of being seen. Men who had ridden cattle across deserts lowered their gazes. Women who had buried children looked away. Even the drunk at the saloon's edge swallowed hard and stared at the ground. It was as if her silence stripped the crowd of its false courage. They had come for spectacle but found themselves standing accused by the mere fact of her standing there. Minutes passed, though the clock in the courthouse struck only once. The air thickened with shame. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell quiet. Then from the far edge of the crowd, movement. A woman stepped forward. She was veiled in a black shawl, its fringes wet with dust. Her figure slight yet rooted with a strength the wind could not move. She walked slowly, her boots striking the boards with the sound of finality. The auctioneer paused, brow furrowed, uncertain. The widow lifted her chin. Her face was weathered, carved with the lines of nights spent awake, but her voice carried steady, unbroken by tremor or doubt. "My daughter is waiting for you," she said. The words hung in the air like the toll of a church bell. The crowd shifted, puzzled murmurs rising, then silenced again by the weight of her tone. No one had expected defiance nor mercy, least of all from her, a widow known for her solitude, for keeping to her farm at the edge of the valley. The girl lowered her head, ashamed, though a flicker stirred beneath her ribs. Something unfamiliar, sharp as a spark catching tinder, shelter, mercy, perhaps even belonging. The auctioneer cleared his throat once more. His hand hovered near his ledger, uncertain whether the ritual had just been broken, whether the words of a single widow could undo the machinery of shame and commerce. But no one bid. No one dared. The square grew still, the sun burning, the dust settling like ashes around them. And in that silence the girl's fate shifted, not yet safe, not yet healed, but moved from the hands of strangers into the promise of a home. The widow extended her shawl, its black cloth fluttering faintly in the hot wind, and the girl stepped down from the platform. For the first time all day, the crowd exhaled. That night the heavens broke open. Rain fell steady and cold, flattening dust into clay, drumming against rooftops, hissing as it struck dying embers in the street. The town huddled behind shutters, but out beyond its edge. A widow led the girl along the wagon track toward her homestead. The girl's bare feet slipped in the mud, her thin figure wrapped in the widow's shawl. She said nothing, though her throat ached with words unsaid. The only sounds were the rain's steady percussion and the creak of the widow's boots as they pressed into sodden earth. When they reached the house, it rose out of the dark like something shaped by endurance rather than comfort. Timbers weathered gray, shutters patched, a porch sagging gently toward the earth. Yet in its bones was a kind of steadfastness. 2 rocking chairs rested there, silent in the rain, their joints creaking like old bones when the wind caught them. Inside smelled of wood smoke, coffee grounds, and iron pans rubbed long with lard. A stove glowed faintly, flame licking against blackened walls. The widow set her shawl on a peg, stoked the fire, and filled a kettle. No questions, no demands. The quiet was not empty but protective, like the hush inside a chapel. The girl sat wrapped in a faded quilt the widow draped over her shoulders, stiff at first, then slowly yielding to its warmth. She listened to the kettle begin its low whistle, a note rising like comfort from metal. On a hook near the door hung a rifle. It gleamed faintly in the firelight, its walnut stock polished though dust lay thick on the barrel. The widow's late husband's weapon, a relic of battles past, oiled but unused, a sentinel keeping watch. When the coffee was ready, the widow poured it black into chipped mugs. She set one before the girl and another by her own place at the table. She added bread, beans cooked soft, and a tin of salt. The girl hesitated, staring as though expecting the food to be taken away. But the widow only bowed her head and began to eat. It was then the child appeared. A little girl, her hair woven in 2 braids tied with faded ribbons. She clutched a rag doll missing an arm, its button eyes hanging loose. She watched the stranger with the cautious wonder of one who knows both loss and trust. The older girl's breath caught. Shame stiffened her shoulders. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself. But the child did not fear her. She only studied her face, then set her doll upon the table and sat close to her mother. The widow spoke at last. Her words were low, steady, shaped by certainty. "This house keeps its own." The girl's gaze flickered. She wanted to believe, yet belief felt dangerous. She had been told she belonged nowhere. She had been moved like cattle, sold like lumber. Belonging was a story she dared not touch. Still she ate. Still she drank the bitter coffee. Still she sat wrapped in the quilt while rain pressed down on the roof and wind rattled the shutters. And as the night deepened, she listened. The rain no longer sounded like warning. It did not echo chains nor boots in the mud. It sounded instead like shelter, like a roof holding against storm. Her shoulders eased for the first time. Not yet safe, not yet sure, but she had crossed a threshold and the storm remained outside. The days did not arrive as gifts but as slow burdens, carried one after another until they blurred. Dawn came with the rooster's crow, the smell of damp straw, the sound of wood splitting beneath the widow's practiced hands. The girl rose when called, not because she wished to, but because stillness felt more dangerous than labor. She learned the rhythm of the farm in fragments, how to scatter grain so the chickens came running, how to mend fences with nails scavenged from old boards, how to carry water without spilling when the ground was slick with frost. Her hands, long accustomed to the bite of iron, now stitched shawls and mended hems, the needle shaking in fingers once bruised by chains. Each task was small, but in its repetition grew a fragile order. Yet when the sun sank, unease returned. In sleep, boots thundered through her skull. Cold iron closed around her wrists once more. She woke with a gasp, quilt damp with sweat, heart rattling in her chest like a trapped bird. She never told the widow, never told the child. Instead, she carried her silence as though it were another scar to be hidden beneath sleeves. Winter pressed in, soft but relentless. Snow drifted against the barn, thick as ash falling from some unseen fire. One evening, she slipped away from the house, seeking distance from the warmth that frightened her more than cold. The barn was dark, save for a lantern flickering near the hay. She crouched in its shadows, clutching the rim of an old wagon wheel as if it might defend her from memories. The widow found her there. She did not scold, nor did she ask. Instead, she reached for the rusted plowshare propped against the wall, running her palm along its pitted edge. Her voice, low and steady, broke the stillness. "Tools remember the hands that held them," she said, "but they can be turned to new work." The girl's eyes dropped to the wagon wheel she clung to. She wanted to believe the words, but the past clung like a burr. Her scars itched beneath her sleeves, whispering of what had been. Could rusted things truly be shaped again? Could broken lives carry new weight? She had no answer. She set the wheel aside but kept her head bowed. It was not the widow who moved her, but the child. Small footsteps pattered across the hay, and there she was, ribbons slipping loose from her braids, clutching something in her small hands. She climbed onto the hay bale beside the girl and, with solemn care, lifted a braid of wildflowers, winter blossoms, pale and fragile, woven with thread too rough for such delicacy. Without asking, the child tied the braid into the older girl's hair. The stems tugged slightly, awkward, but the weight was feather-light. The girl raised her hand as if to remove it. But she did not. She let it remain. Later, in the small room where a cracked mirror hung, she saw her reflection with the flowers still resting in her hair. She flinched as she always did, expecting only the face of a stranger marked by shame. But this time she lingered. The flowers softened the edges. The braid was not the chain of her old life, but a sign of gentleness pressed into her by another's hands. For the first time, she did not look away at once. The scars were still there, buried beneath cloth and silence. They would not vanish. Yet something stirred. The thought that scars were not only remnants of pain but proofs of endurance. They could be carried not as chains but as witness, Snow whispered against the window pane. In the quiet, she touched the flowers in her hair and let them stay. Winter lingered longer than any season had right to. Snow crusted along the fences, ice clung to the water pump, and every breath carried a ghost into the air. The days had grown short, dusk arriving before the lamps were lit, stretching shadows across the valley. It was during one such twilight that the sound of hooves came down the frozen road. The girl stiffened where she stood at the window, a basket of kindling in her arms. The horse's breath steamed in the fading light, carrying a rider cloaked in dust and silence. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but his smile, even from a distance, was clear. The widow stepped onto the porch, her black shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She did not greet him, did not soften her gaze. She waited, feet planted firm on the old boards that had weathered storm and time. The rider reined his horse near the fence, gloved hands easy on the reins. His voice carried with practiced ease, words too smooth for the cold that cut between them. He asked about the girl, about what was owed, about debts that could not be measured in coin. Each syllable was honey laid over iron. Inside, the girl stood barefoot on the floorboards, her heart hammering loud enough to drown the wind. She knew that voice, the cadence of it, a whip cracked in memory, cruelty wrapped in politeness, a chain disguised as courtesy. She trembled when his smile touched her, but this time she did not lower her eyes. Through the doorway she met his gaze, her bare feet rooted as though nailed to the wood. She did not speak. She only refused to look away. The widow's hand shifted near the rifle mounted by the door, her jaw set hard as stone. "You've had your say," she told him, voice carrying through the cold. "This house keeps its own." The rider laughed lightly, though his eyes stayed sharp. He tipped his hat as though the matter were nothing but a delay. "Storm's coming," he said. "Best not stand against it." Then he wheeled his horse, the beast's hooves striking sparks against the frozen ground, and disappeared into the dimming horizon. But he left his words behind like a curse. He would return. When the door closed and the bolt was drawn, the girl collapsed by the fire. The widow draped her shawl over her shoulders, its warmth heavy, grounding. She shivered not from cold but from the echo of that voice. The fire snapped, throwing shadows on the walls like figures from her past. Fear pressed down, heavy as iron. Yet in the glow of the hearth, she felt something she had not known before, the weight of another presence holding with her. The widow sat beside her, silent but steadfast, her hand resting near, not touching, as if to say, "You are not alone." The girl closed her eyes. For so long, fear had been hers to bear in solitude, a private chain. Now shared across two souls, it seemed to loosen. The widow spoke at last, her words low, like embers cracking in the dark. "A storm comes," she said. "We do not face it alone." The girl pressed the shawl closer. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the shutters. But for the first time, she did not shrink from the sound. The storm came as the widow had foretold. By dawn, snow was falling in thick sheets, burying the fields, softening fences into white humps, muting the world until even the rooster's cries sounded distant and uncertain. The wind howled across the valley, carrying a sharpness that cut the skin raw. It was through that snow that the rider returned. This time, he did not come alone. Two men rode at his side, rifles slung careless yet heavy across their saddles. Their horses blew steam into the frozen air, restless, stamping hooves into the drifts. The sound of their arrival carried through the storm, iron-shod hooves cracking against ice until it seemed the whole homestead quivered. The girl was splitting kindling in the yard when she heard them. The axe trembled in her hands, its blade buried halfway through a log. Her breath turned to smoke before her lips, her body tightening as memory surged. She wanted to flee, but her feet rooted her to the ground. The widow stepped onto the porch. She carried her husband's rifle, not across her back as a relic, but cradled against her arm as though it had never left her care. Her face was stern, her shoulders squared against the wind. Behind her the house loomed, its timbers groaning, its shutters rattling but unbroken. The rider smiled again, the same smile he had worn beneath the dusk sky. His voice rang out above the storm, syrup over steel. "Hand her over. She belongs where she was taken from." The two men flanking him shifted their rifles, not yet raised but not at rest either. Their eyes were hungry, careless men who saw only possession, not person. The girl staggered backward, the axe still in her grip. Fear surged through her, but she clutched the worn wood as though it were her only tether to the earth. Her legs shook. Her teeth pressed into her lip until she tasted blood. Yet she did not run. From inside the house came the faint creak of the child's footsteps. Then stillness. The little one had pressed herself against the window shutter, a single eye peering out through a crack, the rag doll clutched in her arms. She saw everything. The widow's voice broke the wind. It did not waver, did not plead. It rang clear as church bells on a Sunday morning. "No more chains. Not under my roof." The words struck the air with finality. The rider's smile faltered. He shifted in his saddle, leaning forward. "You think a rifle makes you strong, woman? Storms bury fences. They bury graves, too." The widow did not move. The rifle rested steady, her finger near the trigger but not trembling. Snow caught in her shawl, white flecks clinging to the black cloth like ashes on mourning garb. The standoff stretched long. Breath billowed from mouths and nostrils. Horses shifted, stamping nervously in the deepening snow. The storm swallowed every sound but the beat of hearts and the creak of leather. The girl stood by the woodpile, her axe lifted now, though her arms shook from the weight. She wanted to scream, to vanish, to crumble. Instead, she planted her bare feet deeper into the snow. For the first time, she stood where danger met her. The rider's men muttered, impatient, teeth chattering. One spat into the snow. "It ain't worth it," he growled. "We can find easier pickings." The rider's jaw worked. His smile returned, thinner now, brittle as ice. He pulled his reins hard, turning his horse with a curse. The two men followed, their rifles never lifted, their eyes sliding away from the rifle aimed at them. Snow swallowed their retreat. Soon only hoofprints remained, filling quickly with white. The widow lowered her rifle, slow and deliberate. The girl's arms fell limp, the axe landing with a dull thud in the drift. Her breath came fast, tearing at her chest. But something inside her shifted, broke open like ice cracking under thaw. She had not hidden. She had stood. She looked to the widow, who stood unshaken, and to the shutter where a small face vanished back into the dark. She was not property. She was not alone. She had been given more than shelter. She had been given a place to stand, a name that no man could strip away. The snow kept falling, burying the tracks, cleansing the earth. Spring thaw came slowly, shy at first. Snow receded in hesitant lines along the fences, revealing earth dark as coffee grounds beneath. The river cracked its icy skin, water trickling free like a wound finally unbound. Birds returned, cautious in their singing, their songs threading through the valley where silence had long prevailed. With the thaw came changes within the girl herself. Her silence, once a wall, softened as the days grew longer. She began to hum as she worked. Small tunes without words, fragments of songs that perhaps she had known as a child, or perhaps she invented on the spot. While she hung damp laundry on the line, the melodies drifted into the open air like threads of smoke. She smiled too, at first faintly, then more often, especially when the widow's daughter came bounding into the yard, braids flying, ribbons unraveling, doll tucked under her arm like a constant companion. The girl would stop her work just to tie the ribbons anew, her fingers deft, her lips curved in quiet joy. Evenings grew gentler. On the porch, as light spilled gold across the valley and shadows stretched long, she began to linger in the rocking chair. The widow sat beside her, their chairs creaking together like a duet of weary bones, while the child played in the dirt at their feet. The girl learned the sound of peace, the sigh of wood under weight, the chirr of crickets, the low hum of cattle settling in the barn. One afternoon, exploring the attic while searching for an extra quilt, the girl found a trunk tucked in a corner beneath dust. Its leather straps were cracked, the lock rusted but unfastened. When she lifted the lid, a faint fragrance drifted out, cedarwood and something older, something like memory. Inside lay a dress. It was a wedding dress, carefully folded though time had yellowed the fabric. Lace sleeves fragile as cobwebs, a bodice stitched with patience, a skirt that once must have swept across wooden floors in dance. She touched it with hesitant fingers as though afraid it might crumble. The widow came up behind her, her steps slow on the attic stairs. She looked at the dress without surprise. "It was mine," she said softly, "but time carries such garments beyond use." The girl lowered her eyes, ashamed to have intruded, but the widow pressed the fabric into her hands. "Every life," she said, "deserves its own garment of honor." The girl could not answer. Instead, her throat closed and she wept, not only for the years stolen, not only for the wounds still tender beneath her skin, but for the gift of being seen whole. No one had ever placed dignity into her hands before. No one had ever suggested she was worthy of honor. That night, by lamplight, she began to mend the dress. Needle and thread moved through the fabric slowly, carefully, stitch by stitch. Her hands, once scarred by chains, now repaired lace, restoring what time had frayed. Night after night, she worked in silence, the lamp glowing gold against the attic walls until the dress began to hold shape again. When at last she finished, she tried it on in secret. It hung loosely on her frame, yet it seemed to breathe with her as though remembering what it had once meant. Not merely ceremony, but promise. She stood before the cracked mirror and did not flinch. The dress did not erase her scars, but it clothed them in something greater, the recognition that she was more than her pain. On a morning warm with spring's breath, she wore the dress into the meadow. The grass brushed her bare ankles, tender shoots bending beneath her steps. The sky arched wide and unbroken above, clouds drifting like sails across a vast blue sea. The widow's daughter clapped her hands with delight, running circles around her with laughter ringing. The girl lifted her face to the sun. She did not think of auctions, nor chains, nor the weight of boots in the night. She thought only of the warmth on her skin, the softness of grass beneath her feet, and the strange lightness in her chest that felt like a future. The widow watched from the porch. Her face, usually stern, softened with something like peace. The rifle still hung by the door, polished, ready if needed. But on that morning, it seemed only another tool of survival, no longer the only shield between them and the world. Later, the girl folded the dress carefully, but not into the trunk. She kept it where she could see it, where its presence reminded her of what had been claimed. It was not a wedding dress anymore. It was a dress of belonging. Seasons would come and go. Storms would rise again. There would always be men who thought to own what was never theirs. But the girl knew now that she had a place to stand, a family to guard and be guarded by, a home where her name meant kin, not property. At dusk, she sat once more in the rocking chair, the quilt over her knees, the widow beside her, the child asleep in her lap. The sky blazed with firelight from the setting sun, and the world seemed to hush. She touched the braid in her hair, tied with wildflowers by small hands, and closed her eyes. For the first time she prayed not for escape but for tomorrow, and for the chance to meet it with her head unbowed. The dress hung nearby, mended, whole. And so at last was she.